what is preventing humanitarian aid from getting to the Gazans? Is Israel blocking it, or Hamas taking it, or no one sending it? What can be done to get the food and water to the Gazans?
Well, I can say a couple of things about that. The evidence is that Israel is not entirely blocking it, but substantially restricting the amount of aid that can get through, and has justified the restrictions by saying that it seems to be falling into the hands of Hamas. There's no evidence of that, and there's no reason really to give it much credibility. The real question is how much political will is there to secure the delivery of the desperately needed medical supplies, food, fuel, and that could be a kind of ultimatum to Israel as a step that the governments that have been supportive of it should at least take a minimal step, the least they can do at this point.
Thank you. I'm wondering, Asaf, if you wanted to come in.
Yeah, well, I'm full. Nothing to add to what Richard said here. One thing I want to point out, this is again looking at my survey that I took this earlier, and I've taken it from the Arabic. Hamas is not necessarily viewed in a positive way by people, the public opinion. So what I see, what I read is that, of course, like we are here, totally in support of the Palestinian, totally in support of those who are being attacked and killed. It's interesting to me that perceive Hamas as, some of them, I mean, I have the statistic in front of me, that Hamas has acted in some irresponsible way, not in a responsible way. One thing I'd like to say, this is not directly to any question that Joe has raised. A few weeks ago, when Joe got in touch with me and we were talking what I can say, one of the things that came up in the conversation is that perhaps I could look at some of the documents that Hamas itself has produced in Arabic and see where they come from and where they're going. And something that I was preparing myself to say, but we're running out of time, is that, and it's not mentioned in the daily press in the United States, it's not in the media. Of course, some people know about that. That in a way, Hamas, I'm going to say the word, is a creation of Israel. In what sense? For 30 years, from the late 1950s, from 67 until the late 1980s, Israel was trying to play the Islamist against what the PLO. And invariably, they would come on the side of the Islamists and trying to cut down the PLO. And I have plenty of documentation on that, what they were doing. And in the founding convention that Hamas, well, it was a group before Hamas. And there was at the time someone by the name of Ahmed Yassin, who was the founder of Hamas. He invited to the founding convention the Israeli governor to be present. I mean, just imagine this. Just imagine this. In 1973, there is this group called Al-Mujamma, which is the precursor of Hamas, which came about, was created in 1989. And the guest of honor, listen to this, the guest of honor is the Israeli military governor who is coming to attend the ceremony. Of course, it made all the groups affiliated with the PLO very angry, but that was the context. and Yassin, who was the head of that group, who were also the founder of Hamas, stayed until the first Intifada, stayed out of any resistance, any active resistance against the Israeli occupier, and put all his effort into things like building mosques, cultural clubs, things of that kind. And one has to say this, and I'll stop at that. The number of mosques under the control of Hamas between 67 and 89 doubled. So what you have is like, it's a large number of with, I have to say, Saudi money also, money from the Gulf. So you can see the picture, all right? Things changed dramatically after the first Intifada. And then you had the Oslo Accord in 93, 95. And the things changed. And now the divide and rule game that Israel has been pursuing is how to get the PA, the Palestinian Authority, which is what came after the PLO, how to use the PA to counter Hamas. So they're playing the same game in a different way. But of course, the PA right now, if you look at the statistic, they're not very well viewed. It's a very corrupt setup. Mahmoud Abbas is not, if there were an election today, will not be re-elected. I'll stop at that.
Could I just add a footnote to what Asaf said? While I was special rapporteur for the UN on Israeli violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, I had the opportunity to meet and talk in detail with several of the Hamas leaders who are living either in Doha or Cairo, and also in Gaza. And at that point, and in the period between 2010 and 2014, Hamas was publicly and by back channels pushing for a 50-year ceasefire with Israel, conditioned on Israel carrying out the unanimous Security Council mandate of 67 that Israel withdraw to the pre-67 borders. And neither the US nor Israel would respond to those diplomatic initiatives. And Hamas, Michel particularly, who was perhaps the most intellectual of the leaders, claimed that he warned Washington through reliable sources that if the ceasefire wasn't accepted or negotiated about, it would produce a period of tragic violence for both sides.
That's helpful news. It brings to mind for me an exchange that I learned of by Matti Peled, who was the #3 general in Israel at the time of the 67 war. A couple of days after the war, he and Ezra Weitzman, who had been the head of the Air Force, were in East Jerusalem. Peled turned to Weitzman and said, well, now we can create the Palestinian state on our own terms and be free of it. Weitzman responded, what are you, crazy? And there we have the major lost opportunity. Irene, I want to thank you for coming back. If you could adjust your computer screen a little bit, we can't see much more than your eyes and your nose. And I guess I want to follow up on what we've just heard here. Is a question from Yossi McIntyre. I can't see that the Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere have done much to pressure Hamas to put an end to continued missile attacks against Israel. Could this concern be addressed? So is there any pressure? How are Hamas's missile attacks perceived, supported, opposed by people in Gaza?
You know, I don't have Joe, I want to intercede here. I don't have an answer to that question, but I do want to ask the person making that question, how do you propose that anyone supporting Hamas or not supporting Hamas can deal with a level of destruction that Israel is responsible for in Gaza, which basically no longer exists? Don't we have to confront that and deal with and take responsibility for the conditions that exist there? What is to follow?
Where can Palestinians go as the population suffers from famine and continued bombing? And I guess the question kind of related to this, I'd add here, is to what degree do you think Israel is pursuing its so-called the so-called commitment to thinning the Gazan population and to a functional second Nakba?
I mean, this is a criminal policy. I don't know that it has to have a formal name, but this is not a policy that's designed to achieve anything but the decapitation of the Palestinian population. If that's the objective, then one has to ask whether that objective will bring any kind of long-term security to Israel, aside from what it means from a human point of view. I think the answer is negative. So I don't know what it means, the proposal that Israel made that the population simply moves south to where? The Egyptian Sinai? Well, the Egyptians have already indicated that they don't welcome this. This is not a policy. This is some kind of a threat of elimination that is to be carried out.
If I could just add that the Israeli campaign after October 7th was not directed toward Hamas's terrorism so much as it was directed toward the forced evacuation of the Palestinians from Gaza and the dispossession in the West Bank. That if Israel really wanted to deal with its own security in an effective way, they're much more efficient and methods that would not have exposed the entire population of civilian population of Gaza to this kind of massive terrorist genocidal attack. And so one has to question the motivations. At best, Israel used the October 7th attack as a pretext for a pre-existing plan to get rid of the Palestinians to the extent they could. And we should remember that before October 7th, and since the Netanyahu coalition government took power, it was known as the most extreme government ever to be elected in Israel. And it gave a green light to settler violence, and it was obviously intent on the end game of the whole Zionist project of claiming territorial sovereignty over the whole of the so-called Promised Land or Greater Israel.
Yeah, I fully agree. I fully agree with what Dick just said. They took what happened on October 7th as a pretext to pursue their plan. And one can see how this is unfolding by looking right now what's happening in the West Bank. Because attention is focused on Gaza, there are all kinds of actions on the West Bank, ethnic cleansing, whole villages are being, their population pushed out. And it's not mentioned in the in the US media. It is mentioned in the Arab media, by the way. So this is taking place. So this is exactly correct, what Dick just said. It has been used as a pretext to continue with the Nakba that has been going on for 75 years now. It's just, and they thought they can do it because, okay, it was a big attack on October 7, and it was atrocious, and they thought, okay, that's now our chance to do it.
I'll just jump in with two things. I had a email from a friend of mine, a Palestinian in Washington, who was writing about the danger that his brother faced, a man who had had an accident, who was both physically and mentally compromised because of it, and was his community was about to be overrun by the IDF. In a situation where this young man could not cope, and under were he to be arrested, tortured, whatever, he simply would not be able to survive. And there are countless stories like this. So I think as we're having this conversation, I think it's very important for us to, over and above just the broader analytical dimensions of it, to always come back to what it means for individual human beings. And also, while I'm at it, before we go to a couple, maybe two last questions, just to call people's attention to this new book by Raja Shahara, We Could Have Been Friends. He's a lawyer and writer. Actually, the book is a National Book Award finalist here in the United States, and it has a very compelling description of the first Nakba and what Palestinians suffered under Jordanian control. Let's see if I can operate the questions here. There's a question here from Mohammed Kaku. What could be the potential long-term solutions to this conflict? Mm-hmm. How important is the role of international mediation and organizations in resolving this? This is the big question. What is possible in the medium to long term here?
Joe.
Yes. Irene, I can't see more than your eyes.
Yeah. Well, although I think this question is really directed at Dick, I would like to say that, of course, peace was always a possibility. The absence of war was always a possibility. The question is, in whose interest is on the ongoing war fought? Who profits from it? I think that we really have to ask that kind of a question, both with respect to US support and in Israel itself. Who benefits from the obvious continuation? Of course, you can say the arms industry, but there's also an industry that's built up of a public opinion that is carefully managed, manicured, so that the kinds of questions that are asked, that, for example, this speaker asked, are not asked. How many times in the US press or in US general discourse, whether it's on campuses and more often off, are these kinds of questions raised in an environment that is not hostile? I think that is something that we have a responsibility for, that we can affect.
Richard, Asaf?
Well, one has to establish a different context than the one that exists now. And that means a different outlook on the part of the Western supporters of Israel, and a different internal Israeli sense of their own interests, their own future. And it's only when substantive pressure is brought to bear on an elite that has gone to these lengths that this current government in Israel has gone to, it is only something very drastic that can shake it from this orientation that is not just, can't be measured in material interests alone. It is motivated in part by this kind of visionary Zionism of a maximal sort that sees the necessity of finishing the struggle in such a way as to eliminate the indigenous people as an obstacle to Jewish supremacy. And that's characteristic of settler colonial states. They all, including the US and Canada, they all have acted to neutralize or exterminate the indigenous people. And that's, in my view, what this is all about. This is a effort to of maximal Zionism to crush the relevance of Palestinian people. And we should remember that Netanyahu was waving this map around, including in the UN General Assembly, that had no Palestine on it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the motivations, undoubtedly, of Hamas was to negative the view that Palestine could be erased. And the old slogan of a land, a people without a land for a land without a people. That was in this early pre-Balfour Zionist utopian thinking, which erased the Palestinians. As Irene said at the very beginning of our webinar, this is not new, what has happened. It's just an extreme, it's so extreme, it exposes the reality that Israel state propaganda and control of the public discourse has managed to distort and hide over the years. So this is a moment of clarity that shouldn't be diverted by considerations that this is just a matter of bargaining for a mutually acceptable solution.
So I'm going to go with one more question, but before going there, simply to say that I've been, as we watch what's been going on, I've also been thinking that this is how the American West was won, with this kind of brutality. And I also have a memory from 1981, before the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, when I was with a delegation that met with Yasser Arafat. It was not a terribly impressive interview, but one thing he said kind of resonated now across these decades. He says, cowboys and Indians all over again, except this time the world is watching in real time, and it changes the dynamics in a really powerful way. I want to close with this last question here, and there are many more, but I think this is, we can only ask so much of our speakers and our audience here. What about Bernie Sanders' initiative in Congress to investigate human rights abuses by countries that receive U.S. aid? I think he's very explicitly introduced a legislation in relationship to Israel. Is this a positive development? Does this move in the direction of trying to open a crack for something more fundamental?
Yes.
Yes, I think so.
It's how could it be negative?
Yeah, of course, it will depend on how seriously it's implemented. You know, we look at these formal changes in law as if they're self-enforcing. And what we should have learned is that law is no better, incapable of being effective unless it's backed by effective political enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to jump in here, and I want to thank each of you for sharing your wisdom, and underneath it, I know your passion as well. I trust that people will be using the recording of this webinar for continued outreach to kind of help build the pressure for the ceasefire that we absolutely need, and for the negotiations, and to prevent the war from widening.